So my name is Lauren Nemeth. I run our sales and account management organization here at AppNexus for the Americas. We are very proud to be a part of the inaugural OpenCo. So thank you all for coming. Today we've got Brandon Atkinson, who's our Senior Vice President of Client Services or Global Services, coming up to talk a little bit about building great teams in a hyper-growth company. As a quick just point before we get started, I'm not sure how many people know about AppNexus and what we do here, but in short, we're next-generation ad serving for both display as well as mobile. So we connect some of the biggest brands both on the buy and sell side, both through an open exchange ecosystem, as well as on our core ad serving product. So a lot of interesting developments. Obviously, you can see the hyper-growth in terms of the size of the company today. We welcome you to our home, and welcome, Brandon.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Lauren. So I don't know if y'all realize, but the rain is actually Lauren's fault. This is, for those of you that don't know, Lauren's moving to San Francisco, and she's going to be leaving soon. And this is God saying, "Don't go, don't go." So thank you, Lauren. I appreciate your timing. Couldn't you leave next week? Anyway, so I'm here to talk today about building great teams in the context of a hypergrowth company. Now, truth be told, that a lot of these concepts are the same if you're in hypergrowth or not, but they're particularly important, as we'll talk about, kind of in this particular context. I've had the honor of building the Global Services Group over the past 3 years from a team of 2, Eddie Chow and Tyler Pines were here before I was, to a team of about 115 now. And this is the framework that I used. Now, to be honest, I didn't necessarily know I was using all of it as I was using it. Some of this is a personal goal of myself this year, was to kind of reflect back on, I was hitting my 3-year mark and just spent some time thinking about, look, I'm pretty darn proud of the team we've built, and I'm pretty darn proud of what we've been able to accomplish. And so, but I wasn't exactly sure what we did. It was kind of like that. It felt like that a lot. So I forced myself to kind of write down what I thought that framework was, and I've called it the GS Manifesto, and this is a part of that. And it's my first chance to try to articulate it out loud, although for those of you on my team, hopefully you've actually heard parts of this before. So in that context, I think what it came down to for me was there were 3 core elements of building a team in a hypergrowth company. The first one really is to define success at the highest possible level, the level that kind of rings true year after year after year. Get crisp on what that is. The second one was articulating the intrinsic characteristics that define the experience your team will experience working for you, working in that context. What are those intrinsic qualities? The third one is really to develop an understanding of the type of person that is going to be great in that context, and then develop a really rigorous framework for how to identify them. So those are the 3 steps I'm going to talk about today. Now, it all starts with, the need to explain what you're trying to build, again, at a level that speaks to your intrinsic motivations. So what does that really mean? It really means 2 things. So let's just kind of break it apart. The first thing is you have to define what success looks like. Now, that means, what are you trying to achieve? That means, what are we here for? What about it is consistent year after year? And that's a question you should ask with your team. That's a question that's not something that you go off on a hill and divine. Although, to be honest, when I first came up with my definition, I was rather drunk, up in the mountains in Poland, sitting on a swing, texting with Eddie Chow. I don't know if Eddie's here. And I said, "Eddie, I think I figured it out. I think this is what we're trying to do. What do you think?" And he was like, "Dude, go drink another beer." But in any case, it wasn't just mine. It was something that I worked on with folks to kind of think about. And it's really not, when you see it, it's not anything all that sophisticated or complicated. But the point is, you've got to define it, because we're not, we're all trying to do something much greater than what we're actually doing on a day-to-day basis, the tactical things. Like if you're in engineering, you're not coding to code. If you're in selling, you're not selling for just for dollars. It's about something else. It's about something greater. So, for example, we in AppNexus, we're about trying to make the internet better. We're about trying to change online advertising and make it work. That matters. That's like the contributions that employees make on a day-to-day basis matter at a much deeper level than what they're just doing on a day-to-day basis. And you know what? Folks need to hear that. We as leaders need to be able to say it out loud again and again. Whatever that definition of success for your team is, you need to be explicit about it. And what you're doing in doing that is really declaring your intention. And what you find is that in work as well as in life, actually stating your intention out loud, it has this force of gravity behind it. Stating your intention out loud pulls all of you in that direction. It's simply what happens. There's something powerful about simply declaring your intention. And that's what we're talking about when we're saying define success. So it can't stop with just defining it. Get it out there. Say it over and over again. Don't let it go. This is particularly important as you grow larger. As you grow larger, all of a sudden, you're feeling separated. You're feeling like there's silos in an org. All of a sudden, you don't know everybody anymore, and you start to feel a little bit more disconnected from, like, what are people trying to achieve? And so creating this common sense of mission, it creates a sense of togetherness. It creates a sense of, although I don't know everybody's name anymore, and thus I feel separate from them, I feel connected because I feel like we're all trying to do the same thing. So it's not just about company mission. A lot of times you hear that's not even just like there's a version of that for your team. If you have a team of 5, there's a version of a definition of success for that team of 5, and it's equally as important for that team as it is for a company. Now, the second thing you need to do, and this gets a little bit more complicated, is you have to describe the employee experience that will lead to that success. So what I mean is, like, the employee experience is how they will describe the experience of working in your team 20 years from now. They'll say, working in Brandon's team was like X. That's what we're talking about. You need to be explicit about that. You need to figure out what that is, because without that's the accelerator. That's the mojo that actually allows you to achieve that overall success definition. So what you'll find is that this is really the foundation of team building. But it's just the foundation. So it's not the doors, it's not the windows, it's not the ceiling yet, but it is the foundation. So you start there. Now, notice I said, though, and this is important, this concept of intrinsic motivations. I said that it has to speak at a level of intrinsic motivations. Intrinsic motivations are what give us direction. They propel us forward. Intrinsic motivations are inherently rewarding and fulfilling as people. And so while intrinsic motivations may vary from person to person, within a person they stay constant over time. Now, what's important then is for you to get a good feeling for what motivates your team. What motivates sales is different than what motivates services, which is different than what motivates engineering, so on and so forth. So you've got to speak at their intrinsic level and define things in a way that they find meaningful. So let me give you an example of that. My personal definition, this is what I texted to Eddie about 2 years ago. I said, look, my definition of success is that 20 years from now, employees who work on my team will look back and say, AppNexus is the best run company I ever worked for. That's it. That's what it's all about. That, to me, will be success. Now, I won't know if I was successful or not until 20 years. That's the shitty part. But the good part is that it's something that, for me, is the North Star. For me, it's what I'm marching towards. Now, in our context, to do that, we sort of, and again, to be honest, like, this is the part where I had to kind of look back and say, well, what was it we were doing? I think I could have done it in advance, but it was a little bit more intuitive, deliberate but intuitive. And what we found was like for employees to look back and say, this is the best run company I ever worked for, there were these 4 qualities that needed to exist. And the first one is that they would look back and say, we're a learning organization. We're an organization where we were intellectually honest with each other. We were really truthful to the best we could about what's working and what's not. We felt empowered to challenge convention. We felt empowered to share what we know. And we had channels to share what we know. We had channels to say, this is what we're trying to achieve, and this is how we're measuring success. We had channels for feedback loops. When things weren't working, we knew how to fix them. Because just being a learning organization was deeply embedded in everything we did, even if we didn't call it that. Like learning organization is something that they might not use those exact words, but the spirit of that is something that, for me to achieve that goal, like folks have to look back and sense that, to be able to articulate that in some way. The second is that folks need to say, you know what, we inspire each other. Could be in big ways or small. I could be inspired by how incredibly thoughtful somebody is about optimization algorithms. I could be incredibly inspired about just the way somebody comes to work and smiles every day. There's something about everybody I work with that inspires me. And that needs to be there. The third thing is that people find their work interesting. That people will say, I was interested every single day. I was interested at work. Because when people are interested, they work damn hard. And when they work damn hard, they're successful. And when they're successful, like that individual success comes together as a team and propels us to our goals. And so that spirit of interestedness is deeply important and will be one of the drivers if we can achieve our goal or not. And the last one is simply that folks will look back and say, we mattered. We mattered in ways big and small. We mattered in big ways. We hopefully fixed online advertising. We mattered in small ways. One particular day, I made a customer's day better because I achieved their expectations on one small thing I did. Or I made a coworker's day better because I smiled at him and said, that was awesome what you did. We mattered. The day doesn't pass that in some way, big or small, we don't feel like we mattered. So those are really the four qualities. Now, again, it's important to say that these speak to intrinsic motivations. Learning, being inspired, being interested, mattering. They're intrinsic qualities. And I believe that if we hold dear to them, if we hold dear our commitment to them, extrinsic motivations, being customer loyalty, revenue growth, great products, those things will naturally follow. So the starting point isn't like business strategies and tactical steps and operational processes. The starting point is, what are the intrinsic qualities that need to exist? Because the extrinsic motivations are really just context. Ad tech is just context. It's not the thing. The extrinsic motivations are measurements of greatness, but they're not the definition of greatness. They're a means to an end, but not an end themselves. And in fact, the end is simply the experience we have while we're achieving those extrinsic motivations. So we focus on developing those intrinsic qualities because we know that's the soil from which great companies grow. What intrinsically motivates people varies. This we know. And so you'll find a way to identify things through your team and through discussion and through experience, that you'll identify what those are for your team, and then you'll find ways to reinforce that. So that's the thought on that. So then, if we define what we're trying to build at a level that speaks to your intrinsic motivations, the next step then is to figure out, how do we find the type of people that will be amazing in that context? So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is that, notice that I said the type of people. I didn't say, and I use those words very, very specifically. I didn't say, what are their skills and experiences, for example? What are the types of people that will be amazing in that context? And this is actually really, really darn hard. It's not actually very hard to say, what are the experiences and skills we need, and then find ways to measure, do people have those skills or not? It's really hard to say, what's the core DNA that'll make somebody successful in our context? And how do we identify if people have that core DNA or not? It's hard work, and to be honest, it's taken us, we're still getting better at it every single quarter. It's not something I'd say we mastered, although it's something I think we're pretty darn good at. And it's super important. And so the reason is because skills alone don't make people amazing. In fact, skills or previous work experience sometimes aren't particularly helpful at all. What matters most are people's capabilities, passions, and values. So let's kind of take those one at a time. Capabilities. Skills are learned, right? Programming is learned, project management is learned, consulting even to a large degree is learned, what ad servers do and how they do it. These are things that are all learned. Now, and with effort, people can learn them, but capabilities are inherent in a person. Capabilities create sort of the ability of people to learn. And so the capabilities are things like the ability to break up complex problems into small digestible parts, the ability to communicate about really difficult, complex things in a way that's understandable and digestible by a peer or a customer. Things like the ability to communicate about something just difficult. Things like abilities like empathy. That's a core capability that people have or they don't. So these are core capabilities. Now, why hire for core capabilities over skills? Skills are easier. You hire somebody that has ad tech skills today, they're adding value in 2 weeks. That sounds like a good thing to do. But there's actually 3 core reasons why we hire for capabilities. The first one is that it expands the recruiting pool, right? In our world, in ad tech, the pool of people that know ad tech really, really well and have the core DNA that we look for is super limited. So if you hire that way, it's pretty slow and hard to get there. The second thing, though, is that it creates a really, really wonderful learning environment in the workforce, because when you bring all these people together from all these different experiences and different skill sets, and lunchtime is amazing. The conversations are great. After work, drinking time or coffee time or just hanging out, it's much more interesting. It creates this really rich, dynamic environment where people are learning from each other and lift each other up because you're able to hire from a really diverse set of backgrounds. But the third is strategically, it helps us scale. When you've hired for capabilities, it means that as the business needs change and you need people to start doing different things, it's easy to pivot because they're natural learners. They have these natural capabilities that'll allow them to be successful in a lot of different contexts. So it definitely helps you scale. And so although this approach, it takes you longer to build, my guidance and my thought would be, it's okay, go for the long term. It's okay if somebody takes a little bit longer or a lot longer to get ramped up because you're building for the long term. You're building for something that lasts. So it's by far worth the investment. Now, the next thing is passion. So the thing about capabilities is they can have all the capabilities that you need for somebody to be successful. But if they're not really, really darn passionate about putting those to use in ways that are helpful to you, it kind of doesn't matter, actually. Because they're going to do it, and then they're not going to be passionate about it, and then they're actually not going to be great at it, even though they could be if they were passionate about it. So digging a layer deep, like peeling the onion deeper to find out what people's passions are, is equally important. Otherwise, you end up hiring, people aren't happy in their jobs after a short time. Now, values is similar. So if folks have the capabilities and the passions, but they're not aligned with your core values, it's a deal breaker, right? Because you can have somebody who, they have the capability of talking about really, really complex things, a deep analytical toolkit where they can solve great problems, and they love actually helping people. But there's something kind of jerky about them. It's not a good fit. If you walk away with nothing else, like each of you as team builders should have, or aspiring team builders, should have a no jerks rule. First and foremost, no jerks. From there, all things are possible. It doesn't matter what school you went to or how high your IQ is or how good you are at something, you got to have a no jerks rule. And that ties to values. So how do we do it in GS in particular? What we did, because the thing is, we've hired teachers from Teach for America. We've hired lawyers. We've hired actors. We've hired a guy who was an international conflict negotiator. We've hired folks from all different backgrounds. Now, we've hired folks from traditional backgrounds too, of course, but from all different backgrounds. And all of these people bring something really unique and special because of the diversity that they offer us. And we find them through this framework. We find them by looking at these 6 areas. The first and foremost is we look for rockstar potential. So what that means really is like they illustrate the personal qualities most attributed to high excellers. That's like kind of the academic thing of what we mean. But the guts of it is you're looking for folks that no matter what they're doing, they're just incredibly committed to being great at it. They work just as hard and care just as much about sweeping the damn floor as they do like creating a presentation for a customer. They care just as much because if they're going to do it, they have to do it the best that they possibly can. Their heart's got to be in it. So rockstar potential, we weigh, again, values is binary, but we weigh that above all of the other criteria more than others because that really speaks to somebody's ultimate potential. The second is analytical horsepower. Now, we're in technical services. We do hard stuff. And so folks have to have that analytical toolkit to be able to understand and break down complex problems. So that's, again, like that core quality's got to be there. Now, in our process, what's interesting is when folks start, there's 2 interviews, those 2. And they don't actually know yet what job they're interviewing for. Because we tell them 70% of the profile for all you folks is the same. 30% decides what role you're actually the best for. And so we go through these 2, and then they go to lunch and they have a nice time up over here in the cafeteria, and the interviewing team deliberates. Do they go on to the afternoon session or not? If they don't, and candidates know this when they come in, if they don't, we send them home. Sorry you didn't make it. If they do, at that point, we say, look, we're interviewing for this one role or maybe these 2 roles. We're still trying to figure out exactly what you're a fit for maybe. But it's only in the second round where you start to get more specific about what the actual job is. And what's helpful about that process is, one, like we've trained everybody in how to interview for those things. We've got really rigorous definitions of what success is, like what a successful candidate looks like in each of these 2, as well as the rest of them that I've talked about. And out of that, like in that day, we can know, like thumbs up, thumbs down, we're going to hire them or not. So when you're in hypergrowth, it's massively important, right? Because the hardest challenge we all face is finding super talented folks without lowering the bar. And so you need to be able to get through it really quickly. And this has helped us do it. Now, I should just briefly say, in the afternoon session, there are these other 4. So we look at technical orientation. Folks don't have to have computer science backgrounds, but they have to love technology. They have to be passionate about living in a technical context and talking about technical geeky things. Like, we're technical services. It has to be there. And the next one is, consultative by nature. So we do hire a lot of consultants, a lot of folks from Accenture, McKinsey, and other places. But you don't have to come from that experience. You just have to have this nature. And essentially what that means for us is you love to understand why. Why are things the way they are? Why do things work that way? And then you're great at being able to evangelize how. How should you do something? How should the world work? How should you think about this customer? That DNA, we love hiring from consulting companies because they teach it, but you don't have to be taught it. Some people just are it. And so that's what we look for. The next one is customer service gene. Like, people need to be pleasers. We're in services. We serve. It's what we do. Day in and day out, we're here to serve. And so they have to have that pleaser gene. It's core to success. And the last is AppNexian at heart. So this is the values thing. So we have an interview that's just focused on values fit. So through these, we're able to quickly identify folks. I'd say we have a pretty awesome rate of hiring the right folks. Very few people do we actually hire and don't work out. A lot of the folks that have left Global Services, the vast majority have been because they either went to another org within GS or they left to go start another company. And quite frankly, if you're going to leave to go start another company, I'm not going to hold that against you. I think it's probably a pretty darn good reason if you're compelled to do it. So that's how we do it. Now, at this point in the talk, you might be kind of asking for more. You might be saying, look, exactly, give me more on like what this has to do with hypergrowth in particular. And you might be asking like, well, we haven't actually talked about, like, you don't have any employees yet. Like, you're just talking about environment. You're talking about how to find them. And those are logical questions. I'd be asking those questions if I was you. But yeah, they're actually related. But here's the key. Here's the takeaway that I'd offer, is when you're in hypergrowth, you need to plan now for 12 months out, 24 months out, 36 months out, to be thinking about what does success look like then, and how do I really get there? So this whole discussion really is about foundation building. It's really about how do you build a foundation that when you need to put a shack on it, you're 5 people, you can put a shack on it. You need to put a house on it, still scales. You need to put a mansion on it, still scales. You need to put a skyscraper on it, still scales. That's the point. It's how do you create that foundation? And that's hard for startups because startups really get focused on, I have this thing today. Like, there's an urgency in startups, which I love. That's why a lot of us are, have a career in them. But that urgency needs to be balanced with long-term thinking. And so we frequently don't think enough about it. And so my ask of you then is to always be thinking about how do we today keep the high agility and high effectiveness in the moment right now that you need to be a startup, while concurrently, simultaneously be thinking about how do we create a foundation that lasts for years. And never make one decision without thinking about the other, both ways. You can't over-index to long-term foundation building because you need to get shit done today, but you can't over-index today because you will implode as a company. If you don't give enough attention and focus to how does this scale, eventually it falls in on itself because you don't have that really strong foundation to build on. So you need to, and my thesis then is it's always worth investing up front to get there. And if you do invest up front, you're going to be able to do much more with greater ease down the road. Like the dividends are a multiplier effect if you do it right up front. Now, the other reason why this foundation building is really so important is because, and this was deliberate. This is something from day one we said out loud. I believed, my boss Michael Rubenstein believed, and we believed it because we'd seen it at every other startup we worked at, which is the folks you hire in those first couple years. In our case, I'd say the first 3 years because of our growth rate. The folks you hire in those early days, they become the heart and soul of the company 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out. That's the nucleus. And so if that's strong, like building on it, much, much easier. If that nucleus is weak, well, you're trying to build on it and things just keep falling in because that strong base isn't there. So those folks first, that first set of folks really matter. But the second is like the habits that they bring in, the point of view that they have, and the point of view that and the habits that they develop in those early years become embedded in your culture for years to come. And so if you can embed habits, embed a point of view, embed an employee experience that helps give you both that agility and execution orientation of now, balanced with how do we scale long term, you've got that really solid foundation to build on. So if you get things right then, that is, explain what you're trying to do in a way that appeals to your own and to your team's intrinsic motivations, and then identify the core DNA of people that will really be amazing in that context. Again, everything becomes easier down the road. Now, there's other things you need to do to build great teams. I confess. This is the foundation. As I mentioned before, I haven't talked to you about putting up pillars and putting up the windows and putting up the walls and putting on the roof. And we don't really have time to talk about that today. But I'll leave you with 2 thoughts on that. So you have people, you have a team, what do you do? And there's just 2 main things, but you could talk about those 2 main things for a whole nother hour. But those 2 main things are, one, the critical thing is design into your onboarding process ways to reinforce your culture. Design it in very, very deliberately. It's a mistake we make that we think people will naturally adopt the local existing culture. It's not true. They'll see some of it, and if they see it, they'll probably mirror it. But what we know is like first impressions last a long, long time, and if those first impressions create behaviors that you want to reinforce, again, everything becomes easier down the road. And so just to talk about it a little bit, an example is in GS we have a process where from week 1, people do a presentation. and it's basically a role play where they're teaching their colleagues about whatever they learned that week. And it's a role play, and their role-playing teacher and the student and their peers who are experts in this are role-playing students, meaning they're asking really dumb questions or they're asking really hard questions. And we're doing it, so we're intentionally testing to the point of failure. Now, there's a very practical reason to do that, and that's test to the point of failure so you know what people know and you know what they don't know. There's another practical reason in that you don't really know what you know until you try to say it out loud. And if you can't say it out loud, you don't really know it. So there's a practical reason we do it. But equally important is the cultural reason. And there's two cultural reasons. One is because we know culturally, people excel when the bar is high. People will live up to the bar that they're given. And so if week one, the bar is, you've got to present, you've got to stand up and tell us what you know. That sets the bar really high. And your teammates are asking you hard questions. They're saying, look, we expect a lot from each other. It sets the bar really high. And people live up to it. It's kind of stressful, it's kind of anxiety-inducing, but people live up to it. And more importantly, from week one, we've set the cultural tone, which is deeply important. The second thing, though, that it does is it also sets the tone of, and it sets the cultural standard of, we're in this together. We have 5, 6, 10 people in the room who are really, really busy because we care about how well you're learning. We have a culture from the beginning of we're all students, we're all teachers. We're in this to help each other. We're deeply committed to knowledge sharing. Those cultural cornerstones get reinforced from week one. So your cultural cornerstones for your team will vary. They'll be different. And that's fine. You can create your own ways to reinforce them. There's hundreds. It's endless. But find ways to reinforce that culture. Now, so that's sort of the first bucket of stuff that you could expand out. The second bucket of stuff from what do you actually do when you have a team as it relates to building a truly great team as opposed to just a good team is to institutionalize operational practices and traditions that reinforce those intrinsic qualities I was talking about before. Now, for example, one of the ways we do that, and again, they're endless, and so we could talk about this for a long time, but one of the ways that we do that is we defined what we call the GS mandate. And it's just the 3 core areas in which, regardless of role, we all measure our own success. And one of them, the second one, is being a generous cross-functional partner. So, for example, then one of the things we do is, in everybody's quarterly goals, they have to tie every quarterly goal back to one of those 3 areas. And so knowledge, like a culture of knowledge sharing, a culture of it will lead to people saying, I'm inspired by people I work with. Well, knowledge sharing is part of being a generous cross-functional partner. So people are tying back to those things. We're finding ways to deliberately encourage, reinforce actions which will allow folks to say those things I want them to say 20 years from now. We embed it in the quarterly goals. We embed it in annual reviews. We talk about it frequently. So you can do all things about that. So I'd love to talk more about that, but just for the sake of time, I'll kind of leave it at those 2. And I want to close with just kind of a little bit of background on how I've developed this perspective myself. And there were 2 formative events for me as to how I got here. The first is that AppNexus is my 4th startup. And in each one of those startups, I've had the opportunity to help build an organization from scratch. But those actually weren't the most impactful experiences that helped me sort of think about these things the way I do. The most impactful experience was when I was a community organizer working for AmeriCorps Vista, which is a national service program. So I was a community organizer in Anchorage, Alaska, working for a nonprofit affordable housing provider. And what you learn as a community organizer is how to identify and harness what are frequently latent talents that haven't really shown themselves, haven't really manifested in a way that creates action. To identify that latent talent, and then use it, with folks in the neighborhoods that you're working in, and then use it in a way to create really impactful, sustaining community organizations. And it's the same process. And so in other words, what you end up doing is figuring out, how do we identify, you really learn that the power of identifying capabilities, passions, and values, and then using that as the thrust. That's the tip of the arrow to then build something that's really lasting and meaningful. So that same process that community organizers go through is a process that we as team leaders go through. It's the same inherent thing. The second thing is that you, as a community organizer, you really learn about building for sustainability. You learn about, as a community organizer, it's basically your job to parachute in to a poor community that doesn't have the capacity that you'd like to create, that doesn't have a community organization. You knock on doors and say, hey, do you want to make your community better? Like, these are things you do. But the intent is to parachute in, like, organize people, mobilize people, train people, for the purpose then of creating a lasting institution in which you can leave and it still exists. And again, that process, like, it's the same kind of thing. It's all about foundation building. And so it's true, just as true for a team leader as it is for a community organizer. The second really formative event that I personally had is, when I started here at AppNexus. So I was employee number 29, and I didn't know anything about ad tech. Like, of all the startups I worked in, they were all complete. There was content management systems, data center automation, CRM for nonprofits, history major, public policy master's degree. Like, I knew nothing about ad tech. And all 28 other folks lived, ate, breathed ad tech experience their whole lives. And by the way, I meant to mention this before. I love people with ad tech experience. I don't not recruit from them on purpose. If I can find them, I'll hire them all day long. I love them. It's just I hire first for capabilities. So I just want to be really clear about that. So in any case, all 28 people had great ad tech experience. I had zero. And I was charged with building a team of ad tech experts. And so, well, all right, I don't really know what that looks like. But all I knew is we had Eddie and Tyler, and I thought they were pretty great. They impressed the heck out of me every day. And so we interviewed a lot of folks, some people with ad tech experience, some with none, and somehow nothing felt right. I wasn't getting really any traction, any momentum on the folks we wanted to hire. And finally, it just kind of occurred to me, well, what is it about Eddie and Tyler that you like? Why are they successful here? And you kind of find out, well, they're both like fearless learners. They're both real diggers. They both kind of share knowledge. They kind of had some of this core DNA. I'm like, well, let me try to find some of that. And then we just kept going through that cycle of saying, okay, like every person who was successful, you just kept looking at, well, what is it that made them successful? And then over time, you continue to refine how you think about hiring to the point of it just becomes a machine because you have enough of a track record of knowing what creates success that you can just smell it. Like I've interviewed so many freaking ICs. Like I literally could do a 30-minute phone screen for an IC and give you with 80% probability if we're going to hire them or not, because you kind of go through that that sort of repetition. So it's really that experience that allowed us to hire. We probably hired over 130 people, and maybe 20 of them had ad tech. And I love those 20. Again, I love people with ad tech when I can find it. But you don't have to, right? Because we're willing to make those long-term investments. And and a lot of times it's kind of shocking to our customers. I was talking to a woman from Rocket Fuel. She's a senior exec there, and she was talking about Kevin Cabral. And she's like, when I first met Kevin, I'm like, who is this dude? He's like a management consultant. Like, I don't work with management consultants in any other place I work. And at first I was like, well, who's AppNexus hiring? And then I got to know him, like, oh my gosh, this guy is really, really smart, and I love working with him. And AppNexus seems to be full of these people that come from backgrounds that are like, what do you do? Because she spent her whole career in ad tech. But they're all amazing, they're all great, and they're all creating huge value. So through that process, and it is a process, is kind of how we develop the framework that we ended up developing in. And it's basically saying, look, we love people with ad tech experience, but at the end of the day, we're hiring for DNA because we're willing to make those long-term bets because it's an accelerator, that they'll end up being a lot more successful because they have those core qualities that drive success. So to recap, building great teams in a startup environment, in a hypergrowth environment, define success at the highest possible level, at the level that rings true year after year. 2, articulate the intrinsic characteristics, the intrinsic qualities that define the experience your team needs to have in order to achieve that success. 3, find out, like develop an understanding of what's the type of person that's going to be most successful in your context. Do those 3, and again, I recognize there's more to building great teams. But this creates the foundation. And if you do this right, let me say the inverse first. If you do this wrong, like, to be honest, nothing else matters. Like, greatness will be elusive. But if you do this right, if you spend a lot of time, keep iterating on it, if you do this right, you'll be able to achieve much, much more with far greater ease. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much for your time. I would love... Thank you. I'd love to answer. We have a Q&A period if there are any. I'd love to answer any questions folks have. If you're not from AppNexus, I'm happy to answer questions about AppNexus. If you are from AppNexus, I'd love to answer any question you've got. So anything at all. Yeah, there's a mic. There's a mic over here.
Oh. Hi, Brendan. If you had to look back and you had to go through it all over again and try to build a team again, what would you say for that framework would be, oh, this is something like the top 3 things that maybe you didn't do, but you would think, well, this would be a pretty easy pitfall to fall in, like a trap to fall in when you're building a team that maybe, you know, it's a easily done mistake, if you will.
Yeah, I think one of the pitfalls is you run the risk of under-communicating cross-functionally about what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. Because, again, I came into the context of people who were all just deeply ad tech experiences. And I didn't have a lot of, they're all busy with their jobs. And so they couldn't, they didn't have a lot, folks didn't have, who were here didn't have a lot of time to help develop our team. So we had to like figure out this bootstrap, like none of us know much, but we're all learning really fast and supporting each other. And so, yeah, I think we were a little bit too insular as a team within GS in the early days. Part of that was out of like a need, like we had to get successful, and part of it was because I just didn't communicate enough. I didn't build enough bridges cross-functionally. You can get so focused on how do you create this thing, because it's really, really hard, that you end up not building the cross-functional bridges you need to make. And so I think in my early days, I think I made that mistake. I hope I fixed it, and I hope I do a lot better at it now. But that was one thing that kind of stands out. The other thing that stands out is, and this isn't, it's kind of related. It's related from a team lead perspective, that when you come in as a leader in a new company, the instinct is, I want to make an impact. Like, I'm coming from wherever I came from, and I was like doing a great job, and I was making a big impact, and I was doing all these things, and so now I want to come and I want to make a big impact. And it's like the absolute worst thing to possibly do, because you don't know anything. Not only do you not know anything about ad tech, like you don't know anything about how the company works. And so it's actually much better to take a deeply humble view of, I just want to learn. Like, I'm just going to sit back, ask a ton of questions, resist the urge to make an impact, and just learn for as long as I can. And so I think I made that mistake when I first started. And so I try to encourage all the folks I hire to not follow in my footsteps there.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting points you made was about how the first few members of the team really set the culture for everyone else. And it was great they had the 2 people when you got there, but I imagine hires 3, 4, 5 were very high stakes, knowing that you really needed someone that was going to contribute to creating a culture.
Yeah.
How do you balance that with being in a hyper-growth organization where we just need to add people and grow, versus, wait a second, maybe we should take our time and find the right person, because this will have a big impact on the future of our company?
Great question, and I think it's really on point. And I'd say 2 things. One, you just need to, it's scary, right? You're trying to hard. Lauren, I don't know if she's still here. She's selling the hell out of our stuff. Like, she's selling it like crazy. And I'm like, I don't know if I can, how am I going to onboard all these accounts? It's scary. It's my job to service, and not being able to service because I don't have enough people is scary. But at the end of the day, it's just, I cannot compromise, period. And so part of it is your own personal conviction of, suck it up. It's scary, but that's what they pay you for. And the second part is trying to create really natural checks and balances for yourself where, at least now we've got a pretty rigorous interviews and efficient interview process. Before, I would put folks through 5, 6, 7, 8 interviews and have them come back on like 1 week, bring it back again, because I didn't trust myself, right? Because I don't know ad tech yet. I'm learning. I don't know exactly what to do, and I'm paranoid because I know that these folks, it impacts the team, and it also impacts your personal brand as a team leader, right? If you hire the wrong person, that's not good for you as a leader either. So it's be super paranoid, never compromise, and build checks and balances. Like talk to absolutely everybody that interviews them, and if they say something that either is contrary to what you thought or kind of scratches an itch that you had, like I wasn't really sure about this thing, just stop and redo, and don't feel bad about bringing people back.